Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Pacific Northwest National Laboratory has developed a contactless system to detect fentanyl and other opioids in real time on site. By eliminating the need to send samples to a lab and wait for test results, this technology has the potential to transform security screening for cargo, baggage, mail, even people. Here with more on the process and its implications is Senior Technical Advisor in the National Security Directorate at PNNL, Kristin Omberg. Ms. Omberg, thank you so much for joining me.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
We're going to talk about some interesting technological developments, but I thought it might be helpful to set a baseline first and have you kind of explain the current state of the art in drug detection technology. How is that done today, especially as we're thinking law enforcement and security applications?
Yeah. So with law enforcement and security applications, it's typically done in the field using handheld devices, or they take a sample back to a laboratory if they have enough time to do that. And all the devices that can be used in the field today have their own set of performance characteristics. Some of them are very good for straight drugs. Some of them are very good for drugs that have been cut with things. But unfortunately, we see so many different types of drugs across the United States right now that it's difficult for one set of equipment to pick them all up in the field. So if a sample can be collected, it goes back to a lab. And at a lab, it takes typically an hour on the instrument to analyze it. So when it gets to the instrument, it's an hour to a result from there, which makes the results fairly significantly delayed from when the sample was collected.
So that makes a lot of sense and also presents some real challenges for enforcement and detection. Your team has recently developed a new system, a contactless system for detecting fentanyl. Can you describe what this new discovery is and how it works?
I can. It was originally developed to detect explosives vapor in airports, but we have adapted it to detect actually a number of different illicit narcotics, including fentanyl, heroin, methamphetamine, and others. It works on ion mobility spectrometry, which is a fancy way of saying it looks at the mass of what you are detecting, which is the same principle that's used in the laboratories. So when you take a drug back to a laboratory for analysis, it's typically analyzed using mass spectrometry. And ion mobility spectrometry is very similar, but we've been able to put it into a very small package that can be actually taken out into the field and returns a result in about a minute.
Wow, it really is sort of portable. When you talk about mass spectrometry, there was a statistic in your recent article that I just found fascinating, like looking for one pine needle in all the pine trees in the state of Washington. Can you tell us a little bit more about, that's phenomenal. Help us understand it in application.
It is phenomenal. When we first started working on ion mobility spectrometry for explosives, the reason we chose the technique that's being used is because it can be about as sensitive as a dog in detection. And no one really fully understands what the sensitivity of a dog is or how much it might vary. We just know they're great at detecting things. So one of the first things we had to do was quantify how much we could detect. And it is in the parts per quadrillion, which is where the analogy to one pine needle in the state of Washington comes. So 1 part per quadrillion is about equal to 1 pine needle in the entire green state of Washington.
That's amazing. But it does make a lot of sense. And of course, whenever we're thinking about drug detection, we think about dogs and TSA lines and other sorts of places. So mimicking a dog's nose is kind of where you're headed then.
It is. And it's important because opioids, like fentanyl, don't have a very high vapor pressure. So they don't put off a tremendous amount of signal, which is why it's so amazing that dogs can be trained to detect them. But it also makes it challenging for the technologies that detect them, because in order to detect them without having a sample collected, it has to be that sensitive.
I'm speaking with Kristin Omberg. She's a senior technical advisor in the National Security Directorate at Pacific Northwest National Laboratories. Well, you mentioned that this new technology can detect not just fentanyl, but a variety of other illicit narcotics. Given the ever-evolving nature of these, they're straight, they're cut, they're mixed with other things, there are new formulations all the time. How does your new system adjust to capture what might be unforeseen variations at this point?
The new system does an excellent job of capturing things that will be cut with different agents. We are looking at whether or not it will detect other variants of opioids. We know it will detect the ones that we commonly see in the United States, but as you know, they are always evolving. So we are looking at how applicable it will be to the drugs that we're going to see in 5 years. So far, it's looking pretty good because of the way that it works, but it's hard to predict what we're going to see next year even.
Well, we started talking about the applications for this in security and law enforcement operations, but I can imagine this would have impacts in medical situations or other sorts. Can you describe for us how you imagine this technology being used and applied?
Yeah, so we are specifically looking right now at applying it at the border, particularly the U.S. southern border, where a lot of synthetic drugs come into the United States. But you could also apply it, for example, at an airport screening facility where people are walking through. One of the challenges specifically with fentanyl that we are trying to understand is that there is a lot of fentanyl out there for medical purposes. There are a lot of opioids that are legitimately prescribed to people. And so there will always be a background level of those. And trying to distinguish between legitimate medical use and illicit drugs is very difficult. And in a screening situation such as TSA, we want to be really sure that we have a small number of false positives, because we don't want to pull people out of a security line because they have a prescription for something that we've picked up on the device. We want to pull them out if they are carrying something that is illicit. And that's the next challenge, I think, with this technology.
How will you address that false positive issue, or what are the next stages in your research as you advance the technology?
We are trying to figure out right now what a normal background looks like in some of these environments. So we recently tested the technology at the border at Nogales, Arizona. And while we were there, we collected background samples of what's just normally going through at the border crossing. From those, we'll be able to get an idea of what we ought to expect to see. And if we were to take it, for example, into airports to work with TSA, we would have to do the same thing. We'd have to really look at what is the background that's going through and how would we differentiate signal of an illicit drug from background.
What is it going to take to get the technology, the innovation from where it is now into a commercially viable device that you might see at a border crossing or at a TSA line or in an emergency room?
Right. We have been fortunate to commercialize the technology. So we are working with a manufacturer who is putting it into a portable device. So at this point, we are at the prototype stage. And if we continue to demonstrate its utility, our hope is that because we have a commercial partner, it will naturally end up becoming a commercial off-the-shelf instrument.
Well, that is very cool. Do you imagine it being expanded into other sorts of detection?
Right now, it'll do explosives and illicit drugs, and it will also do chemical weapons. So anything with a distinct chemical structure, I think we could expand into. It's just a question of whether or not there's a driving need for us to do that for national security.
I've been speaking with Kristin Omberg. She's a senior technical advisor in the National Security Directorate at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Thank you so much for joining me and for explaining this really impactful technology.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule and on your devices. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.